Welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. I'm your host, Yaakov Katz. The dilemma surrounding the hostage deal with Hamas is one that cannot be understated. On one hand, there's the undeniable, urgent need to bring the hostages home, those who are still alive, and those whose bodies are being cynically held by the murderous terrorist group in Gaza. At a very basic level, we need to remember that there are hostages alive in Gaza. Estimates suggest that at least half of them are, and that they can be brought home now. This war began with the brutal attack on October 7th, during which 251 people were abducted. The return to their families is the very essence, at least in my opinion, of what victory should look like. But there is, of course, the other side to this equation, and that is the immense risks that Israel now faces. The government is entering, potentially, now there seems to be some problems in the way, but we'll discuss them. The government has entered into this deal reluctantly. And they are aware in the government of the fundamental flaw of this deal, and that is Hamas's refusal to let all the hostages go in one batch. Instead, the deal is structured in a way that will see 33 Israelis released in several batches over the next 42 days. On day 16, the sides will again commence negotiations for the second phase of the deal, which is supposed to ensure the return of all the remaining hostages. But here's the main question. Can Hamas even be trusted to follow through on the second phase? And the answer is painfully clear, that we cannot trust Hamas. I'm joined by two of my fellows at JPPI, Professor Gil Troy and Noah Slepkov, to discuss this deal. So Gil, let's start with you. There's a lot of problems that are potentially here, and I think that the dilemma is a real one for the state of Israel and for Israelis in large. How do you see what seems to be coming if this deal actually does come to the government, as it is expected to? We're recording this Thursday afternoon, and the cabinet is meant to meet at some point, approve the deal, and then it will be brought. There's some technical, the ratification, the High Court of Justice. People get an opportunity to potentially appeal and petition against the release of some of the Palestinian prisoners. But assuming everything goes as planned, Sunday or Monday, Israel will start to get back some of those hostages. How do you see what's happening?
So it's interesting. The messaging I'm getting mostly from the United States is joyous. That's a word being used by members of Congress, being used by friends of mine in the American Jewish community. Today I was at the foreign ministry for a different meeting, and someone emphasized a different thing. He said it's a day of hope. And I can sit with day of hope more than I can sit with joyous. This is very, very painful. I find, first of all, let's take a step back. The normalization of hostage taking, the degree to which it's been sort of seen as legitimate in many ways, and the balancing of Israeli hostages, civilians, babies, women, children, removed from their homes and tortured repeatedly, and how that's been compared with Palestinian prisoners is to, equate terrorism and pure evil with the complexities of running a democratic country where you have to defend yourself. So there are all kinds of distortions even before we get to the deal itself. The joy or the hope comes from every single life is precious, and any human being who is saved from that living hell it's an amazing gift. On the other hand, if we go back to a year ago in November, when they released 100 hostages and then just stopped, and it was Hamas that just sort of stopped. And my fear at the time was that they didn't want to release any more because they didn't want us to see the damage that they had done, particularly to the young women. And now I think they have a sense that things have moved, and so they can kind of put up with whatever reputational damage they endure. So it's a very complicated moment, a very, very difficult moment. And I'm speaking to many reservists who feel like, what did we fight this war for?
It's an interesting question, because on the one hand, when you look at the deal, and Noah, you and I were just talking about this offline, the text of the deal that's being circulated is very similar to the deal that was in place back in May. And even Yossi Fuchs, who's the cabinet secretary for Netanyahu, said that this is a similar deal to the deal that was in place in May. President Joe Biden took credit, basically, saying this was the deal that I proposed back in May. But in May, Israel and Hamas did not reach a deal, and that's where things start to get a little complicated. On the one hand, we heard just recently from outgoing Secretary of State Tony Blinken that it was Hamas that was putting up opposition and resistance to the deal. Although, if you were to read the Israeli media, it would seem that it was the Israeli government and primarily the prime minister who was upholding the deal. Then we have Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national rabble-rouser, as I call him, who's also known as the national security minister, who said and took credit the other day in a grotesque way, if you ask me, for saying I was able to torpedo the deal numerous times over the last year. But my point is, maybe this deal could have been made in May. But on the other hand, had it been made in May, and I think this is this just adds again to the two sides to this, that May was before we took down Hezbollah, was before Assad was toppled, was before we had the October blows with Iran, which then we took out Iran's S-300 systems, and Iran is more vulnerable. In other words, it was, and Hamas was even stronger then than it is now. So yes, hostages have died in captivity in that time since, no doubt. But maybe from a strategic perspective, for Israel at least, it would not have been right to have made that deal back in May.
There's no doubt that everything you said is correct, that we are in a much stronger defensive situation today than we were in May. But there's been countless number of people who have died in Gaza since then. And ultimately, the question is how long is this deal going to last? I mean, we're basically agreeing to the October 6th situation where we are letting Hamas, even if you let this deal go to fruition, that all the hostages are returned, Hamas stays in power, according to this deal. And that's a situation that's, this government has said that this was, something they were going to fight for, that this war is not going to end with Hamas still in control. And you have that. So you're totally right that we're in a much stronger situation today to make this deal. And Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. I mean, one of the factors about making this deal back in May was the notion that if we leave the Philadelphia corridor and we go back in, it's going to cause another war with Hezbollah. It's going to cause more problems in the region. And we don't want to be in a situation where we pull out of something and then risk losing the peace with Lebanon and the security in the region. And the situation today is that we don't have that fear of, okay, if we do this, it's going to spark a bigger war with Hezbollah because we've neutralized Hezbollah. So yes, we're in a far better situation for this deal. But I don't know how you look at this deal and say that it's a good deal for Israel. I mean, it's a necessary deal. I think it's the best deal that this government was able to do, given the fact that they weren't prepared to take bold steps to try to actually solve this. My daughter this morning, who's 8, I woke her up and I said, the hostages are coming home. And she said, we made peace with Hamas. And I said, it's not quite a peace deal. And it's not. And we're just going to be continuing the status quo after this agreement.
Well, I mean, I think that the reason we might be continuing the status quo is also a result of the fact that we have yet to see or hear or know about whatever the government's plan is for the day after Gaza. We're now there. The day after, once
this is the day after.
Effect, this is
the plan.
This is the famous day after that everyone has been talking about for the last 15, almost 16 months. And we still don't know exactly what's going to happen. And the concern that has always been there. And I think that this is how I've always looked to some extent at this war, and this is why this war, as opposed to other conflicts, is so complicated. In general, asymmetric warfare is always going to be tough. You have a conventional military, a country that is run by the rule of law, has a judicial system, has a parliament, has an open media and free press. Us, in other words, Israel, fighting against a cynical terrorist organization, as we've seen Hamas and the way they use civilian infrastructure, is always going to be lopsided. But what happened on October 7th, to some extent, we lost the war at the beginning of the war, right? On October 7th, when they took 251 people hostage, massacred another 1,200 people in the worst way imaginable. But what I always thought was that if I told you guys back in October 8th, we're going to win. And what's win going to look like? We're going to get back all the hostages, but Hamas will remain intact. One of you or both of you might have said, well, that's not a victory. Yes, we'll get back the hostages, but Hamas is still there. And then what if I told you the opposite? is that we'll defeat Hamas, we'll destroy Hamas, we'll remove Hamas from power, but the hostages will be lost. Also, that wouldn't be a victory. And that's why from day one of this conflict, there was never going to be, at least in my opinion, a decisive victory, the one that the government had us believe when they were talking, wearing hats with the nitzachon muchlat, right, total victory, trying to convince us that was even possible. That was never possible to begin with. And I think, Gil, to some extent, this is this great dilemma that Israel faces, because what we've seen over the last 16 months is that we are threatened in ways that we didn't believe back in October of 2023. We knew that there was Hamas, we knew there was Hezbollah, we knew there was Iran, we knew there were the Houthis, we knew there were all these bad guys out there, but we thought we were strong. We thought we could take them on. We never thought that something like this can happen. We've learned in this period of time is that we're far from being safe. We're far from being invincible. We're far from being secure, and we might not be able to win the way that we thought we could win.
This war has always had core contradictions. Not only the balance between trying to save the hostages, which we discovered you can't really do militarily when they're deep in tunnels, and are also, frankly, embedded in the civilian population. Yes, those innocent, holy civilians have also collaborated, in Gaza, have collaborated in this unspeakable crime. So that was one contradiction. But you can't go to war saying, oh, I just want a partial victory. Our young people had to fight aggressively, and I'm not afraid of that word, with the hope that we could have a complete victory. Now, at the end of this 15-month process, we have to ask a few critical questions. One, the question that defeated Kamala Harris: are you better off than you were, in this case, 15 months ago? And I would argue, I agree with Noah and I agree with you, that first of all, we're safer objectively than we were October 6th. And we're safer objectively than we were in May. I would also add an issue what happened in the region. We've killed Sinwar. We've further degraded Hamas. Now, from the very start of the war, some of us, myself included, said, you can't defeat an idea. You can't defeat the Hamas movement. What you can do is degrade it sufficiently. And so that's one of the things that I think has been achieved. The other thing that's been achieved is, let's throw that word in, deterrence. Because I think that 3 months into the war, 4 months into the war, when we again were so afraid of Hezbollah, as you've mentioned, we hadn't restored deterrence. I think we have made Gaza look like Gaza as a message to Beirut, as a message to Tehran, as a message to other, and I'm saying cities because we had to make it very clear that you can't mess with us. So yes, we don't have full victory, but in this kind of conflict, full victory in some ways was an illusion. But I think we've had impressive achievements. So that's one dimension. Let's add two other dimensions. One, Secretary Blinken, who's given a series of interviews and speeches which are fascinating, which in some ways don't take full responsibility for some of his failures, but he has emphasized, where was the world? He has repeatedly said that had the world put more pressure on Hamas, then things would have been different. And I remember early on in the first series of podcasts we had, when we talked about the Reconstruction, and we compared it to the Reconstruction of World War II, after World War II of Nazis and of Nazi Germany and Japan, one of the things we pointed out was that the world was in 1945, 48, 50, anti-fascist. And the world, in this world, is pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas in many ways. And so it's much harder to expect that kind of denazification. The third dimension we have to emphasize is the two elephants in the room, Biden and Trump. And what we really don't know is what have been the back and forth contacts between the Netanyahu government and the incoming Trump administration regarding incentives. Why does Bibi feel compelled now in a way that he didn't feel compelled by the Biden people? What's going on? Anyone who thinks they know what's going on doesn't know what's going on.
That, by the way, that's usually the case as somebody who's been writing about what's been going on for the last 25 years. There is no question, though, that the Trump effect has had an effect here, right? And that this window of time of just, 4 days until the inauguration, now there is a deal that looks like it's being finalized and a deal that has been reached, was partially, I think, reached because of the fact that the sides all understood that Trump is someone who might be unpredictable, and it is in their interest to give him this victory even before he takes office. It's probably a combination of something of Trump's doing, Biden's doing, everyone kind of connected one to the other, and everyone contributing to this at the same time. But I'm curious, Noah, as you look at what's happening, how much, there's been a lot of reporting of that Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East special envoy, came here on Saturday, met with Netanyahu, and basically pressured him into accepting the deal and easing up on some of the Israeli demands. This is Netanyahu, and we started to already hear some of the Netanyahu mouthpieces saying, it doesn't look like Trump is actually going to be as good as we thought he would be for the right wing in Israel. What do you make of that Trump element here?
Yeah, Trump is totally unpredictable, and what you said it. The fact that there's all this talk about what's not in the agreement, that there's deals on the side, that Israel's going to get weapons to bomb Iran, that the Trump team was already saying how Hamas isn't going to be able to stay in power and it needs to be demilitarized and it can't be able to regain its strength. So you have all these buzzwords that Bibi got what he wanted from Trump, but those aren't in the agreement. And if he did get those things, we won't know until it's revealed several years down the road. So you don't know what was said in closed doors. Maybe one day historians like Gil will write about it. But I don't think the message that the Arab world is going to get from this war is, Israel defeated Hamas. It's the exact opposite. Hamas is going to complain. It's going to say they were victorious. They're going to claim victory. All the rebuilding, all the damage in Gaza is going to be paid for by Qatar and other countries to rebuild Gaza. And we're just going to be in the same situation. Maybe there won't be rockets for 3-4 years, which is going to be great for the southern communities. But in that time, Hamas is going to rebuild. It's going to constitute its forces again. And in 15 years, when we think Hamas doesn't want war with Israel, we're going to be caught off guard again because we're not addressing the root cause of this conflict, which is that Hamas and the Palestinians who support them do not see Israel having a right to be here, and Israel did not end this war with a statement from Hamas that Israel has a right to be here, and we're going to make peace with it until Israel is prepared to fight for peace. And because Netanyahu and his government doesn't want to make peace with the Palestinians, that wasn't something that they were prepared to put statements about. If they had made statements from the start of this war that Israel seeks peace with the Palestinians, that Israel wants to end this, let this be the last war with the Palestinians, and this was a fight for peace, the world would have had a different reaction, because peace is something people fight for. In World War II, there was peace. There was a fight for peace. There wasn't a fight for a ceasefire. And so this is an unsustainable ceasefire, if it even manages to go beyond the 42 days, which... you already hear in Israel, the government is saying that Netanyahu promised them this war is not going to be over and they're going to continue to fight Hamas. So the statements of this government and the right-wing parties, Bezalel Smotrich, he's already saying that he's going to back the first stage of this agreement and not the second stage. What's the second stage? The second stage is when the rest of the hostages come back. So you already have statements from this government saying we only support the first part of this deal. So we know it's not going to be a sustainable agreement. Of course, I can't wait to see the hostages come home. They deserve to come home. They shouldn't be stuck in Gaza because of this government. So this is the best deal that this incompetent government was able to muster, and it's a pretty bad deal. If Yair Lapid was prime minister for the last 15 months and he was able to get this deal, Netanyahu would be polling at 80 seats right now.
It's true, and we know that because if you remember back when Yair Lapid was prime minister and reached the gas deal with Lebanon, Netanyahu said this is a terrible deal. I'm going to cancel the deal when I become prime minister. Well, Netanyahu's now been prime minister for 2 years since he took office. He hasn't canceled the deal with the gas deal with Lebanon. So of course, there's always talk of a lot of different things that don't mean much in reality. Gil, the Israeli political system is in a bit of an upheaval at the moment, right? Itamar Ben-Gvir, we don't know exactly what he'll do. He's obviously going to vote against it. He'll probably also pull out. Bezalel Smotrich had kind of been on the fence. just recently a few moments ago, put out a statement where it seems that he's going to vote against the deal, of course, but he'll stay in the government for the time being, for the first stage, at least to see that Israel returns to fight in the aftermath of that first stage of the war, of the deal, sorry. My feeling is that the world's not going to want Israel to go back and fight, right? I mean, what we're going to have happen here, and you mentioned before Gaza and what's happened to Gaza, and there's a tragedy for the people of the civilians of Gaza. I think it's Hamas's fault, but a tragedy has taken place there. People are going to go back to their destroyed homes. There's going to be aid coming in. The world is going to descend on Gaza with aid and money and attempts to assist. No one's going to support Israel's right to go back in. Now, if the hostages aren't returned, more hostages, maybe that will be some sort of leverage. But do you really think that people are going to say, okay, Israel, Hamas violated, yeah, go back in and restart the war? I mean, it's going to be a little more complicated than that.
It will definitely be more complicated. Look, I want to emphasize a second amazing thing from this deal. One is, again, every human being who comes in, it's extraordinary. Of course, we're terrified to see what condition they're going to be under because they have really endured unspeakable, inexcusable tortures. But if the reports are correct, and I say that as a historian, always wary about because I'm only reading secondhand reports, and it's just been sort of accepted that Israel has this buffer zone around the Gaza corridor. That's a huge win. That's a huge win for Israel on two levels. First of all, the whole dynamic with Israel and the Palestinians has been how much territory can we give back, give back, give back. This is the first time we've taken territory. And I actually believe that in the Palestinian national culture, territory is worth much more than human beings. And the fact that because of October 7th, Hamas lost territory and is the first Palestinian entity to lose territory since 1967 is huge. And I think we have to, and that buffer zone also protects my cousin and the tens of thousands of people who I hope will be moving back to the Otef, to the corridor. So that's something that I do want to emphasize as a positive. Look, in terms of the politics, Yair Lapid has said that he will protect the government if it's teetering because of a hostage deal. We've also seen that Netanyahu was able to increase his majority by bringing in Gideon Sa'ar. So the government is a little bit less unstable than it was. Over the course of the years and the year and a half in this podcast, I've often criticized Netanyahu. I think we have to acknowledge that while it's not a great deal, Bibi Netanyahu has withstood tremendous pressure, especially from the Americans, again and again and again. And we only have been able to accomplish enough. And by the way, it's interesting to watch Biden and Blinken boasting about Iran and Syria and Lebanon, when in many ways it's because Bibi defied the Americans. So this is where I'm really torn today. On the one hand, I don't trust them. On the one hand, it breaks my heart that we don't have a full accounting of every one of the hostages. I believe that they're going to keep a certain number back and torture us emotionally again and again and again while they continue to torture them physically and emotionally. But I think we also have to focus on the achievements that we were able to achieve and hope that that will help rebalance things. We also haven't mentioned the Saudi Arabian dimension. We don't really know what's going to happen with that. So there are very difficult moments to be frustrated. Also, there are some signs of hope.
The Saudi Arabia, which you do mention, is a unique opportunity for Israel, and the President Trump does talk about it as being something that can now move forward with the possible ceasefire that's in place. And he obviously has his own interest in expanding the Abraham Accords, which he was responsible for, but also in maybe getting that Nobel Peace Prize that he thought he deserved, back in 2020 with the Abraham Accords. What I found to be very interesting all throughout this war was the fact that when we look at the Arab countries, that we have peace with, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, none of them have canceled the peace treaty, and the Saudis openly still discuss the prospect of regional integration, as they call it, or additional normalization. They don't like to use the term Abraham Accords. That belongs to the smaller country, UAE. They'll need something different and a bigger name. But this is a unique opportunity. I got to think, and getting back also to what we just were talking about, Noah, the prospect of Saudi normalization that could be on the table, the end of this war, Israel now marching in a new direction, having the support of the Trump administration, redeploying along the new defensive lines, whatever those might be, And we still, again, don't know what that day after plan is going to look like and who's going to control Gaza and who's going to govern it. I'm assuming that there will be some sort of entity that's going to oversee humanitarian aid and reconstruction, whatever is going to happen. But this should be a big win for Netanyahu also to some extent. I mean, why is it not being portrayed that way? Why in the government are people not celebrating? We won. We're now getting back also the hostages. We might have normalization with Saudi.
Because those are imaginary victories that aren't part of this agreement. Yes, there is in the background that if indeed this agreement is based on a future Saudi-Israel peace deal that is being negotiated, or that that this is the reason why Netanyahu is able to push it through his government, then great. Like, we're going to look back at this. It's like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We didn't know that America was going to pull missiles out of Poland, I think it was, right, Gil? Turkey. We didn't know that at the time. It only came out later. So if indeed we look back at this deal in 3 years and say, yes, this deal was the start of the Saudi-Israel peace normalization, then of course it's going to be celebrated. But because we don't know that's part of this deal, and because we know that Saudi Arabia has said that in order for there to be peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, or normalization, Israel has to do something to recognize a Palestinian state, some declaration, something that some constructed ambiguity that Israel can do, that the Saudis can say, "Hi, you see what we got? We got Israel to agree to a Palestinian state." If the Saudis' demands up until now are legitimate, is what they actually believe, Israel will need to recognize a Palestinian state, or something that can be construed as recognition of a Palestinian state. So if we already are negotiating an end of this, a permanent ceasefire, as they're calling it, why not include in this the bigger picture with Saudi Arabia? Why isn't there a deal with Saudi Arabia in this? 15 months of war. How many? 600 soldiers have died? Is that correct?
More, almost 840. Yeah,
840 soldiers have died. Too many. And at the end of the day, we're just getting a permanent ceasefire with an enemy that's still sworn to destroy us. You're going to see people in Gaza are celebrating this victory. We already saw that there's celebrations, candy being distributed. We are going to see Palestinian people who were already released with the Gilad Shalit deal, who were then arrested and re-put into the Israeli prison system, and now they're getting released again. A whole new generation of Hamas leaders are now being released from Israeli prisons, going back. What scares me is the release of terrorists, of Hamas terrorists, not in the West Bank and Gaza. If they're in the West Bank and Gaza, we can follow them. We know where they are. We can keep a watch on them. But Hamas terrorists being released to Qatar and other countries in the world, that's a scary thought, that you have people who are terrorists getting released into the world as part of this deal. And we're not getting even a normalization with Saudi Arabia.
We're not getting all the hostages back yet either.
We're not getting all the hostages back. And we don't even know if the hostages we're getting back, if they're even alive. And this is the thing. 33 hostages, dead or alive. We don't know how many of them are alive. And you said yourself there are about 50 hostages still alive. That's the estimate of, in total, there's 50 hostages still alive. And this is an agreement for 33 hostages, dead or alive. So that means
released over 42 days. No, listen, I think
so
we all agree.
There's another,
we all
at least.
Agree. This is a flawed agreement. But the question that we have to ask ourselves, so long into this conflict, is there something better?
Not by this government.
Well,
period.
So this is the crux of it all. And when you think about it, I mean, we did once upon a time, and you're right, this was the mistake, right? For Gilad Shalit in 2011, we released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. One of them was Yahya Sinwar, the murderous, ruthless, barbaric Hamas leader who went on to orchestrate and be the architect of the October 7th attack. This is the risk we will be taking. And in the sick reality that we live in, we still appreciate, I think, the value of a human life much more than they do. That's obvious. But we are willing to take the risks to bring these people home. And part of me is concerned and I am worried of what's coming. But part of me also is proud of our country, that we are unique and we're willing to do things that other countries might not be willing to do. And I to some extent, I want to be part of that country. I want to be part of the country that's willing to do that. I want to be part of the country that I know that if I'm in my bedroom and I'm sleeping and at 6:29 in the morning, terrorists break into my house and they take me or they take my kids or they take my wife or they take my family, that my country will not give up and they will try to do what they can to get me back. And they could do more and they could do less. And
15 months later.
What the right is. You're right. Okay, maybe it could have been sooner. But do I want to be part of that country, or do I want to be part of the country that says we're not going to negotiate with terrorists and we're not going to have anything to do, and people will get lost? And we have a case. We have a Rona Rod, an Israeli Air Force navigator who was downed over Lebanon in the 80s, who we till today do not know what happened to Rona Rod.
And sadly, that's going to be the fate of I'm afraid many of the hostages who are presumed to be in Gaza, that we just are going to lose track of them because of this, not because of this agreement, because of Hamas. Of course, this is all because of Hamas. Let's not lose sight. This is, Hamas has a deranged theory that they can somehow destroy Israel. And if this war didn't teach them that they can't destroy Israel, nothing will teach them that. And that's why I want to be part of a country that makes peace and doesn't make ceasefire agreements that are just going to cause wars.
Well, I agree with you that we do need to have a bigger plan. But Gil, I do want to ask you. I mean, we with the return of hostages, and let's hope and pray that this deal sticks together and it stays, and that on day 16 the negotiations begin and we're able to reach another stage in the deal and it doesn't all fall apart and the rest of the hostages. Because remember, we're getting back now, according to the deal, the women, the children. We don't know what their status of all of these people. The Bibas children, those are the 2 kids who are still there. No one knows for certain. Are they alive? Are they dead? The women, including the Tatzpitaniot, right, the soldiers, the female soldiers who were stationed along the border with Gaza, and other women, the U.S. citizens who are alive, Keith Siegel and Sagi Dekelchain. I mean, there's the men over 55, some of the sick, but the younger men, the male soldiers and men under the age of 55, they're remaining in Hamas captivity for now. But, and we've spoken about this before, Gil, there's a healing process that a nation does need to go through. And we were never going to be able to heal from the wounds of October 7 as long as our people were being kept in Gaza. I mean, is this now possibly the beginning of that healing process?
We will only have the healing process if we also have leadership. We have to have a vision. We have to hear what the day after, as you were saying earlier, it looks like. We have to learn how to take the power of our soldiers where they understand you can have unity without uniformity and take it to the streets. So, at any given moment in time in history, things can be won and things can be lost. Think about 1967. After 6 days, I think there were very few Israelis who said, "Oh, we have a headache here." And while it was a unique and euphoric victory, and thank God, because it saved the country, there also was a certain high price to pay because of the ongoing question of what to do with the territories. In 1973, most Israelis were saying, "Oh my goodness, we were defeated. Look at this horrific surprise attack." Who would have known that after 1973, neither the Egyptian army nor the Syrian army would ever dare try to invade us again? So this is where diplomacy comes in, behind the scenes, and this is where public leadership comes in front. And this is what we desperately need from our own leaders, and we also need some very thoughtful, creative statesmanship from the world. And I want to go back to this critique of the world. I want to go back to the fact that the world has facilitated and prolonged the war, even while they were yelling hostages, hostages, hostages. Even while they were blaming Bibi, they weren't doing enough to say to Hamas, what is wrong with you? And I think we also have to ask a little our questions about the obsession even within Israel with demonizing Bibi Netanyahu. How much of that has prolonged the hostage agony? Because the pressure should have been on Qatar. The pressure should have been on Turkey. The pressure should have been on Hamas, and instead it was on Bibi Netanyahu. So I think our leaders have things to learn about, but I think also the people in the street have to start thinking about what kind of Israel do we want to make? How do we take this moment and build from it rather than continuing trying to knock one another down? But I'm thinking through this conversation, and I know I would feel very differently about this deal if we hadn't had the beeper success, if we hadn't had those successes you mentioned at the beginning against Iran, if we hadn't had the collapse of Syria, and if again we didn't see the Blinken and Biden final speeches trying to take credit for things that we accomplished. And so I think it's very important that we focus on the things that we accomplished, the way in which Israel has really served the cause of peace and the world, and try to start changing that narrative internally and externally, not because it's a spin, but because it's true in all its complexity.
You know, Bezrat Hashem, please God, God willing, on Sunday when I think it's 3 hostages are released, no matter what we all think, whether we're in favor of the deal, whether we're against the deal, Jews, and I think even just random people around the world will watch those images, people who have carefully followed this conflict since the beginning. And there will not be a dry eye. People will be watching as we don't know what to expect, right? Hospitals are being told here in Israel to prepare for malnourishment, for people who are not just in bad condition, but hurt and wounded, and the trauma of what it's been. I read somewhere even they're being told about lighting in rooms to keep it dim, not to turn on too strong lights. They're not used to light in these dark tunnels that they've been in.
They did a lot of, they spoke to the prisoners, the hostages that were released back a year ago, and asked them what part of the process really bothered you. And based on those conversations, they've adapted, maybe they don't want to overwhelm them with family. Maybe all these types of things is something they've really been cognizant of.
Yeah. But I think this is going to be a moment that we will remember for a long time, hopefully. It will be a moment of so long. This has been what the war, at least I believe, this is what the war has been about. And you're right, Noah and Gil, and I think we're all saying pretty much the same thing, is that we have a bigger picture. We have a longer term strategy we also can't ignore. And that is the removal of Hamas, that is preventing Hamas from reconstituting itself, that is embarking on a journey or a process that leads to some sort of stability so we don't do this, as you said so well, Noah, in another 2-3 years from now, and we fall back into that cycle that we were at before October 7th, where every 2 years, 2.5 years since the 2005 withdrawal from Gaza, we were fighting a mini war with Hamas in Gaza, and we were, saying, okay, we knock them, they knock us, but we knock them more, and then we just kick the can down the road. We cannot go back to kicking the can down the road. But I think we have a moment now, and there's something about focusing on this moment also. And the message it sends us, the message it sends our children, and the message it sends, I think, to the wider world. And I want to end with that optimism. I think that this is an opportunity for us to maybe have some optimism that this is part of that larger picture, that we're going in maybe the right direction. This is to some extent the tikkun, the rectifying or the repairing, the healing that we also need, because there can't be healing. Israelis cannot move on as long as our people are stuck in Gaza. And we mentioned Ron Arad before. There's not a single Israeli who doesn't know Ron Arad, because he is a symbol of what happens when we fail to get back our people. And that's why we cannot allow something like this to happen. So let me thank both of you for joining me today on what's a complicated day and a complicated reality for us here in Israel. And I think for Jews and people worldwide who care about this country, who care about these people, and are waiting to see what's going to happen. So we pray for good news. I hope by the time, to all of you viewers and listeners, by the time we meet again on Monday, we'll have seen some of the hostages come home, and we'll be able to at least appreciate for that one moment in time, those few hostages, the rescue of them and the saving of those lives is something that we cannot be just apathetic to and not take to heart. So let me thank you both. To all our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us again today. Have a Shabbat Shalom, a good weekend. Let's hope for some good news over the weekend as things move forward towards the potential release of some of the hostages. You can find us always where podcasts can be found on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and of course the Times of Israel.